Hello, English 351 and 651. I hope all of you are safe and healthy, and I hope that you are at work on your essays on Coleridge and or Dorothy Wordsworth. Those will be due, as I said, on Thursday, March 26th. You can email those to me by 5 p.m. Eastern Time, unless you hear otherwise. This week you'll be reading the essays of De Quincey. I hope you're doing that as well. I want you to read by Friday, March 27th, all the essays that I assigned on the syllabus, all the essays of De Quincey. You will post by 5 p.m. on Friday a forum response to De Quincey. I will, of course, set up that forum post for you sometime this week. As I said in an earlier email, if you have any questions at all, certainly I'd like you to email me. If you would like to have a more detailed conversation, I'm happy to engage with you via WebEx or even a telephone call. So this short video is meant to introduce you to the work of De Quincey. The work of Hazlitt. In later videos, I will be addressing specific essays. So, the thing to get about Hazlitt, first and foremost, is he was a man of great energy, great passion, both to his advantage. You can feel the intensity in his writing, and to his disadvantage. He made a lot of enemies during his lifetime because he never pulled his punches. I use the boxing metaphor deliberately. Hazlitt was a great fan of boxing. He wrote a brutal essay on the subject called The Fight. He himself was a practiced boxer. He was also a very skilled player in an early form of racquetball known as fives. And his playing was infamous for not only its intensity, but also for its anger, its violence. He was an early version of the petulant tennis player, the John McEnroe of his time. If you know who John McEnroe was, he was often one to throw his racket, to yell at the line judges, to pitch temper tantrums right there on the court. Luckily, we have first-hand descriptions of how Hazlitt played this game, fives. So here's one of his contemporary, a man named Patmore, describing how Hazlitt played this game. When Hazlitt played fives, you would hear sighs, groans, lamentations, and these left no doubt that Hazlitt was becoming warm in the spirit of the game. He would fling his racket to the other end of the court, walk deliberately to the center with uplifted hands, and he would imprecate the most fearful curses on his head for his stupidity, and then rush to the side wall and literally dash his head against it. This is not the kind of behavior we would see in someone like Charles Lamb, who had trouble walking, much less running or playing a game, or the rather corpulent and easily winded Coleridge, and the rather staid, overly decorous Wordsworth. There's another description of Hazlitt playing this game. There was not a particle of energy about him ordinarily, meaning that when Hazlitt was hanging out in the London coffee houses and pubs, he often seemed lethargic. But when he kindled, a flush spread over his sunken cheeks. His eyes lighted up wildly. His chest expanded. He looked like one inspired. His motions were eloquent, and his whole form partook of enthusiasm. So there's a physicality to Hazlitt's writing style. And Hazlitt came to this physicality not only through his love of bodies in motion, bodies in graceful motion, but he also came to it based on his study of the great Italian painter Titian, as well as his own training as a painter. William Hazlitt was a very successful portrait painter during his time. His portrait of Charles Lamb still hangs in the National Gallery in London. His brother was an especially talented portrait painter. And through his study of Titian, his favorite artist, again, a Renaissance Italian artist, and through his own training in painting, he came up with a concept for what he most admired in a work of visual art, but we can transfer this quality to what he admired in writing as well. And that concept is called gusto. So bear with me as I find the quotation I'm looking for. In his essay on gusto, which you are reading, he says the following. Here's Hazlitt. Gusto in art is power or passion defining any object. And Titian is replete with gusto. Here's what he says about Titian. Not only do his heads seem to think, his bodies seem to feel. Flesh seems sensitive and alive all over. Not merely to have, not only to look at the flesh, the texture of the flesh, but the feeling of the flesh as well. In other words, when you look at a Titian painting, you not only see the colors of the flesh, but it's as if you feel the very texture, the animation of the flesh. You can sense the blood circulating here and there. The blue veins just appear. The rest is distinguished throughout only by that sort of tingling sensation to the eye, which the body feels within itself. Now, this idea of gusto, Keats will latch onto rather fervently, and it appears quite prominently in his letters, which we'll see later on. So what do we want to know about Hazlitt from the get-go in terms of the main shape of his life? Well, I'm going to focus on just a few aspects of the life, again, by way of introducing him to you. The first thing to understand about Hazlitt's life was the influence of his father, also named William. William Hazlitt Sr. was a very prominent Unitarian minister. Not only that, he was very liberal. He was what was known as a dissenting minister, meaning that he believed that there should not be a top-down hierarchy ruling the church, but a bottom-up process. The congregation themselves should vote who should be the minister, and the minister himself, during the time himself, should be given full freedom in what he will preach about. And connected with this, with William Hazlitt Sr., was a political sense that we should have full agency. He was very much against monarchy. He was excited by the possibility of a democracy. He was a big reader of people like Thomas Paine and Joseph Priestley, with whom we've come into contact so far. There was even a time in William Sr.'s life when he took his whole family to America. And so young William Hazlitt Jr., spent his adolescence partially in the United States of America, in Boston, where his father tried to find a church he could settle in. He was unsuccessful doing so, and eventually came back to England, to Shropshire, and settled in the small village of Wem, W-E-M, and that is where William spent his childhood. His father was extremely learned and put a lot of emphasis on book learning, in particular philosophy. So young William was deeply trained, mainly in the empiricism, British empiricism, Locke, Hume, Berkeley, and was especially keen on the philosophy of David Hume, And early in his life, Hazlitt himself wanted to be a philosopher. That was his first desire. And you'll remember in Expostulation and Reply and The Tables Turned, the Wordsworth poems, early Wordsworth poems, 1798, These poems depict a conversation that William Wordsworth had with William Hazlitt, a philosophical discussion where Hazlitt was basically arguing you need to read philosophical texts to become a moral being, or as Wordsworth said, you could simply imbibe the natural environment in wise passiveness. So, emphasis on philosophy, emphasis on book learning, an education in dissenting thought. Hazlitt remained his entire life a fiery liberal and often clashed with Coleridge later on politically. Hazlitt was an ardent admirer of Napoleon. He thought Napoleon was sort of the beginning of an overthrow of monarchy worldwide, and that excited him. He spent almost his entire life working on a biography of Napoleon. When Napoleon died, Hazlitt went on a several-week drunk. People saw him wandering around London, sloshed, unshaven, and unbathed. It's quite sad. As I said, Hazlitt, when he realized that probably he couldn't make a living as a philosopher, thought early on that he would become a painter. So he did train to become a painter, and he painted portraits of Wordsworth and painted a very important portrait of Charles Lamb, as I've mentioned before. The keen visuality you see in his writing, the attention to visual details, very striking visual details, I think comes out of his study in painting. Well, in 1803, he went to the Lake District where he was going to paint Coleridge. And there he ran into a bit of a scrape. And this scrape exemplifies a third part of Hazlitt's life, his attitude toward women. Apparently, Hazlitt went to a pub in Keswick, which was where Coleridge was living at the time, in Greta Hall. And he seems to have got into some kind of flirtation with a young woman there, and it seems that she denied his overtures, and that he responded maybe jokingly by pretending to spank her. It seems like it was, yes, inappropriate, probably, definitely from our point of view. Inappropriate. But at the time, maybe just something somewhat playful. But in any case, the men there at the pub took umbrage with this activity and threatened to dunk him in a nearby lake. Again, it's hard to tell how serious this was. In any case, Hazlitt fled, and by the end had to have Wordsworth and Coleridge sneak him out of the Lake District. Well, later on, as Coleridge and Wordsworth grew to dislike Hazlitt because of his politics and because of some of the things he wrote about them, this incident became darker and darker and darker until by the end, Wordsworth was treating it as if it were an act of terrible evil, of sinister lasciviousness. I guess all lasciviousness is sinister. But this is just a sign of the kind of problems Hazlitt had with women. He seemed to fall for women of all kinds pretty quickly and pretty hard, and set himself up for disappointment. He did marry in 1808 one Sarah Stoddard, a good friend of Charles and Mary Lamb. This was not necessarily a marriage of love, more of a language of compatibility. They were both very intelligent. Stoddard was a very intelligent woman for her time. She got pregnant 3 times. Unfortunately, 2 of the children died, 1 lived. But the marriage was never that passionate, and the two spent more and more time apart until 1820, when the defining event for some happened in Hazlitt's life. He fell very hard for the daughter of his landlord, one Sarah Walker, and he was over 20 years older than she was, and it seems that she may have led him on a bit, may have promised him affections that she didn't deliver, but in any case, he fell profoundly and self-destructively in love with her. He wanted to get a divorce from his wife. He was able to arrange what's known as a Scotch divorce, meaning he could not get one in England, but he got one in Scotland. He had to pay a lot of money, had to go through a lot of trouble. He finally got it, comes back to Sarah Walker, and she says, sorry, not interested. And in fact, she soon after, I think, ended up with another man. So this destroyed Hazlitt. He ended up writing a book about it called Liber Amoris, the Book of Love. And it's one of the most vulnerable, raw confessions of the obsessiveness and silliness and dehumanization, craziness of romantic love. The book embarrassed many of Hazlitt's friends and really kind of ruined his literary reputation for the rest of his days. He published it in the early 1820s and died in 1830. And really, the book kind of made it hard for him to find publishers who would take him on after that. Now it's considered something of a masterpiece in our age, where raw confession is often lauded in literature. It's also quite experimental formally as well. So, the father in philosophy, the painting, women. The fourth part of Hazlitt's life that is important to us is his career as a lecturer. He actually, starting in 1812, began lecturing in various London venues on philosophy, on poetry, and his lectures on Elizabethan drama were especially well taken. His takes on Shakespeare, which grew out of Charles Lamb's own takes, profoundly influenced John Keats. John Keats's ideas of negative capability, for instance, the idea that the poet has no ego, for instance. These came out of Hazlitt's take on Shakespeare as someone who, in his plays, did not argue a position, but simply became the various characters of his plays. This very subtle psychological reading of the characters we find in Hazlitt, in a sense that what made Shakespeare so great was his ability to enter empathetically into all of his various characters, to become them, whether they are good, whether they're evil, whether they are vulgar, whether they are brilliant. Well, he made some money, Hazlitt did, as a lecturer, but he gained most of his income as he developed as a journalist. So he was born in 1778. I didn't mention that yet. So he's a little younger than Lamb and Coleridge. And he starts writing for these emerging magazines throughout the 18 teens, the Examiner, the Champion, for instance. And eventually he ends up writing for London Magazine, the magazine that made Charles Lamb famous, the magazine for which Charles Lamb developed his famous pseudonym Elia, or Elia, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And so as a magazine writer, Hazlitt developed his aesthetic. The essays we're reading come from collections of essays that were first magazine articles. So we need to get that, meaning that these pieces were written usually on short deadlines. They were often written in a quick burst. They were not meant to be in books. They were meant to be in the ephemera of magazine writing. Now, apparently Hazlitt had a habit of sleeping in. He would stay up very late. He would sleep very late. He would wake up, have many cups of tea and many pieces of toast, 20 pieces of toast, I think someone said, at around noon. And then he would sit and stare at the fire for 2 or 3 hours, and then he would get to it. And often he would write the essays in one sitting. And you get that feeling of like onward motion, of kind of linguistic abandon, one sentence piling on another sentence in a quick rush of creativity, in a piece like On the Pleasure of Hating, for instance. So I think that those are the main parts of Hazlitt's life we want to get. The kind of athletic sensibility when it comes to language, valuing power, passion, intensity, gusto, which grows out of his own practice as a fives player, as well as his own appreciation of sports. His training in philosophy, we see in his writing the use of antithesis, opposition. He makes very fine, interesting distinctions throughout. This comes from his philosophical training. Uh, Also, the visual sensibility we see in his essays growing out of his training as a painter. Um, his history with women generates a sense of longing, a sense of desire and fulfillment being constantly at odds with one another. And we see that in many of his essays where he'll simply digress from his subject to talk about how miserable he is now or how what he's wanted in life he has not gotten. These asides, these existentialist asides, largely grew out of his failures as a lover, quite frankly. Um, Hazlitt, the lecturer, we see him. We see the essays have the quality of like a spoken voice. They're very conversational. They have that sort of everydayness to them. We can imagine him actually delivering some of these essays in conversation at one of Lamb's literary gatherings, perhaps. And finally, the idea that the essays were written as a magazine articles first and foremost. So there's an immediacy and a quickness, improvisational quality to those essays. So that is the beginning of Hazlitt. I will address some of his particular essays in later lectures, which will be shorter, I think, than this one. All right, stay safe, stay healthy. Let me know if you have any questions. This is EGW signing off.